Now we have Richard Fallon, who has just finished a PhD at the University of Leicester on the popularization of dinosaurs in particular in Anglo-American culture. And is this based on stuff from the PhD?
It's based on part of a chapter, yeah.
And so this is from the Royal Academy for the Lost World and Popularizing Palaeontology with Arthur Conan Doyle and Patrick Lewis Forbes.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about Arthur Conan Doyle, who's most famously the author of the Sherlock Holmes stories. He was also a fan of popular science himself. He wrote about it quite a bit, and in his own eyes, a scientific researcher later in his life when he really starts to dig into psychic research. But most famously, of course, he's a novelist and author of fiction. And The Lost World is probably one of the most influential texts on dinosaurs. It wasn't exactly super innovative in terms of the plot, but it certainly had that kind of shaping of popular culture afterwards, especially after the 1925 film. And so there's a lot to say about popularizing paleontology and The Lost World, but because this is a group on popularizing paleontology, I'm going to go very, very specific and talk about the artist who did the first edition illustrations in the Lost World book version, P.L. Forbes, who was Conan Doyle's brother-in-law. And this is the book jacket of the first edition of The Lost World, which is quite a rare. So this is the frontispiece to the novel. This image appears in most editions. We're depicting the characters as this kind of fake photograph. So you have the protagonist, Edward Malone, who is a young journalist who wants to go on an adventure to impress his girlfriend. He gets involved with this bearded man, Professor Challenger, who's a kind of rambunctious scientist who claims that there is this plateau in South America. By the way, many will probably know the plot of this novel, but I'll go through it briefly. He claims there's a plateau in South America filled with dinosaurs. So Malone and him start to organise this kind of semi-press funded exhibition to go there. And they go along with Professor Challenger's nemesis, a sceptical Summerlee, and a big game hunter called Lord John Roxton. They go to this plateau. They do find dinosaurs, unsurprisingly. They also find a tribe of what are called ape men and the indigenous people, and they end up helping the indigenous people to slaughter the ape men for some reason. Then they bring back a pterodactyl to London and prove that the journey was true by releasing this pterodactyl in the Queen's Hall. And so this image is fairly well known. The characters on here are depicted by Conan Doyle and some of his friends. So Malone is played by William Ransford, a photographer from Hampstead who took a series of photographs, and Conan Doyle actually one of the photographs himself. Conan Doyle plays Professor Challenger. He's got a beard on. And P.L. Forbes, Conan Doyle's brother-in-law, plays two characters because it's a composite, Summerlee and Lord John Roxton. And so these are quite famous for Lost World. There's a couple of images, fake photographs of the plateau, fake photograph of these characters in various poses. And it's the Lost World novel, I'd say, is quite conventional. It's working in a tradition that goes back quite a long way. Although this was unusual to have such a kind of sophisticated fake. Having fake appendices and footnotes and things in adventure fiction was really quite a common trope at the time. This is how The Lost World first appeared. So this is the first version, the American version of a Sunday magazine, which is a weekly supplement to newspapers in the US. Appears in March 1912, illustrated by a guy called Joseph Clement Cole, who's a professional illustrator. As you can see, he makes everyone incredibly jagged. This here, Malone, is supposed to be 23, but he looks a bit more like Gone with the Wind. And on the left, you've got the Strand magazine, which is the British version. This is where the Sherlock Holmes stories appeared, one of the best-selling monthly serials in the UK and in the world. Illustrated by another professional, Harry Roundtree. And so you can see his illustrations here, pretty action-packed. This is in the first issue. There's a lot of spoilers here. This is the frontispiece of the first issue. There's the ape men, there's people being chucked off a cliff. So Conan Doyle actually didn't have anything to do with these illustrations. In fact, he actively seems to have disliked this one. I have no idea what he thought about this, but he probably had nothing to do with it. Conan Doyle oversaw the photographs by Ransford, and he also oversaw the series of illustrations by Forbes, which I haven't shown yet. And he clearly thought they were the superior version of The Lost World, and they only appear in the book. He says to his editor when he was complaining about Roundtree's images, quote, "I shall have a free hand in the book, and you'll see the effect." And he's about the only person who have ever been particularly excited about the book version of The Lost World. So I think it's worth looking into why Conan Doyle thought it was so special. So this is Forbes' MO, kind of watercolours of rural and kind of nostalgic local scenes, hundreds of pictures of Hampstead. He was particularly active in the 1900s. He exhibited before the Royal Academy a lot. He seems to have struggled after that, and he disappears really after the 1910s and seems to have had quite a depressing life in many ways. But he was very prolific at one period, and you can still... I always wanted to eBay some of his pictures because you could get them like 60 quid, but they are very boring. Which seems to have been what Conan Doyle was looking for. He wasn't looking for a fantasy illustrator. So these are the 7 illustrations Forbes made, as far as I can tell, for The Lost World. And sometimes they're misattributed, but I'm pretty sure, certainly these are all by Forbes, and I'm 90 million % sure these are as well. So these appeared in the first edition of the book. Three of the illustrations are depicted as by a character in a novel, Maple White, who's this dead artist whose sketchbook is found by Professor Challenger, depicting a Stegosaurus and various things, which is one of his items of proof that there is this lost world. And 4 by Malone, which are presented as being sketched when the characters have reached this plateau. And so I've always wondered if there's a colour version of any of these. I don't know where any of these images are nowadays, so I only have the versions from the book versions of The Lost World. And you can see there's sort of a slight difference in style, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And so this is a slide that, even though it looks very boring, please don't tweet it. I don't know why you would, because it is archival stuff. I might get sued. It's very scary. So during late 1911, Conan Doyle got in contact with Forbes, his brother-in-law. Not really clear how well they knew each other. They seem to have been fairly familiar. Forbes was also friends with Ransford, which is how Conan Doyle got in touch with him. And Conan Doyle sent Forbes very detailed cut-out pages of books with instructions on how to make those illustrations. So they're really, this is basically, that's the background for the pterodactyl swamp, and you stick on that pterodactyl, you put it like that, get rid of this, get rid of that. It's very detailed. He also sent him photographic samples because he wanted, effectively, he wanted the sketches or watercolors to be glazed and made to look like photographs in an early stage. And it seems to have given up on this idea. One of them actually does look pretty good, the pterodactyl swamp, but it seems like eventually he realized that wasn't going to work. So they might have been intended to go alongside the photographs and sort of like be presented as if the whole novel was, all the details were photographs. You can see his sort of rough sketches, pages and things like that. And so yeah, there's plenty of stuff like this, and the letters are also very detailed and very pedantic. So this is something that Conan Doyle and Forbes took pretty seriously. So Roundtree in the Strand magazine made hundreds of illustrations of Lost World. Most pages have an illustration on, which is what people paid for, really. Forbes only made, as you can tell, 7 images. Conan Doyle clearly had nothing to do with the Roundtree ones, but some of them do correspond. And this one, we know Conan Doyle's opinion about the difference between them. So this is a central lake in the middle of a plateau in South America, which is called Maple White Land in the novel, where ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs and pterodactyls and turtles and things. So you can see from Roundtree's one, it's close up, it's in the middle of the lake, there's tons going on. You can actually see the characters in the background looking out upon the lake. There's a very different dynamic in Forbes' image. I think it has a sort of sense that it may have been intended to be a photograph at this stage, or at least potentially been presented as one. There's not much surviving in terms of a correspondence between them. But it's much more mysterious and distant and fuzzy and faded. And you can sort of, there's a lot more room for the imagination, whereas in this one it's almost, it's kind of a bit like one of the books of a roaring dinosaur on the front. So Conan Doyle wrote to his editor towards the end of his serialization and asked, when complaining about Roundtree and spelling his name wrong, he said, "I don't understand how anyone could prefer Roundtree's Central Lake Aquarium to the mystery and suggestion of Forbes's picture." Which is interesting because I don't think anyone else has ever been particularly complimentary about this picture or any of the Forbes ones. But clearly, Conan Doyle really did think there was something deeper in this image than in Roundtree's. And Roundtree's, professional. He could churn out kind of images which were much more saleable. But Conan Doyle wasn't super interested in that. And so I think that starts to get to what Conan Doyle thought the Lost World's visual apparatus could do for paleontology. So one of the more well-known facts about the Lost World is that this Stegosaurus, which appears early on this Maple White sketch, is just almost identical tracing of an image of a Stegosaurus from a popular book for children by Ray Lancaster, which in itself was a tracing of another image. In fact, this is the case for all of the dinosaurs and extinct animals in the Forbes images. Even if they've been shrunk, they're just kind of pretty much taken. So pterodactyl correspondence there, even a plesiosaur, and there's not really much to it. There's also a difference, an intentional difference, I think, between the Stegosaurus by Maple White and the Malone sketches here. So I don't think the tracing exactly is just kind of that image he was feeling particularly lazy. I think it's intentional. That was a popular book, it's based on a popular lecture series, and that image was on display. This image was on display in the Natural History Museum. And it's also pretty typical of kind of PopPaleo images from the time. It's a dinosaur in a lateral pose, pretty close up, showing all its anatomical features. This wouldn't be particularly useful in a popular paleontology book because it doesn't show the iguanodon very well. And in fact, we know that Conan Doyle insisted on keeping this Stegosaurus, as he says in a letter defending it, because the editor seems to have thought it looked a bit silly. And Conan Doyle explained that its head actually was that small. And this is the only Forbes image that was serialized. This Forbes image appears in the Strand, whereas all this other stuff was left out and was never published until the book. So Conan Doyle really wanted this image to be there. And I think this is different because This image is shown in the novel to Malone, this sketch in the sketchbook. Professor Challenger tells Malone to go and pick up a copy of, effectively, Ray Lankes's Extinct Animals and compare them. So the reader was expected to realise that this is a pretty familiar image. Of course, Malone's not convinced because he says, well, the artist could have just taken it from this book. And so that's this early stage of skepticism. But by the time he's got to the plateau and he's among these dinosaurs, the entire tone changes and becomes much more romantic, much more suggestive. And I think that's why we have a kind of complete move of the dinosaurs and things into the distance. There's this little figure in here kind of waving and sort of, it's almost semi-pagan, that picture. It looks like an 18th century kind of neoclassical painting. There's much more sort of sense of wonder in those than this one that's literally almost traced from an original image. Conan Doyle's instructions are pretty specific for things like that, getting rid of details. So in the original one of these, Forbes had drawn two pteranodon in the background, and Conan Doyle wrote to and said, I wonder if, quote, the effect would not be more horrible without the two in the air, as the thing you can't quite see is more weird, thank you, than the thing exposed, which is the philosophy Forbes was clearly going on for the rest of it, less is more. Conan Doyle actually was notoriously complained about illustrations in his stories. He thought they gave away to his endings, which they did. He thought they were too literal. He wanted generally the illustrations to be a little bit more kind of, I wouldn't say metaphorical, but not to literally depict what he described all the time. And generally, he seemed to think generally less illustration is superior, but the Strand way he published his work, people bought it because there were so many illustrations. And so he never, despite being one of the most successful authors in the world, seemed to have had much editorial control over it. Now we can see the same difference between the Central Lake pictures in Forbes' pterodactyl swamp and his iguanodon glade and Roundtree's. So the close-up, the kind of impossible angle for a human to be up. In that scene, they're describing it from a distance anyway, so it doesn't really follow the novel. Got the characters down here, whereas there's much more sort of a sense of that distance. And also, they feel less dangerous. They feel a bit more wonderful with Roundtree's, which are really kind of action poses. And I think the most important quotation is in a letter by Forbes, which was written in August 1912. Conan Doyle's just written to him, and Forbes is clearly already starting to go downhill by this point. And Conan Doyle said, your illustrations will eventually be published in the book version. And Forbes sends him this very fawning letter thanking him for that, and Roundtree's won't be placed. And Forbes says to him, quote, I've never liked to express to you my feelings with regard to the pictures now appearing in the Strand, for fear it might seem I was jealous. But that horrid striving after sensational pictures, the blood and thunder instead of the mysterious poetry, the inaccurate drawing of the animals, if possible, have tended to lessen the high tone and truthful scientific accuracy of your story. All along I have felt with you that the only way to help the mystery that runs throughout the story is to try and make the pictures mysterious and, if possible, beautiful, the animals only suggested, but truthfully, and let the imagination of each reader fill in the details which his mind conjures up. An illustrated Bible, for instance, would utterly spoil its charm, which is, you notice, the only time the Lost World has been compared to the Bible. But I think the hyperbole there really shows how seriously this was taken. So, to go back to the quote about the Central Lake in Roundtree's version as an aquarium, which I think is really quite suggestive and interesting. He says, how anyone could prefer Roundtree's Central Lake aquarium to the mystery and suggestion of Forbes' picture. I think the aquarium here represents, kind of for Conan Doyle at least, in a romance novel, the over-close examination that lessens the mystery, the sense of either domestic, having an aquarium in your house, or metropolitan, like this amazingly sleazy-looking guy lounging in the Ack. I think that's what he's going for. This is none of a sense of romance that Conan Doyle wanted in his his adventure fiction, and generally Conan Doyle is obsessed with this word romance, the sense of imagination, mystery, something slightly shrouded, which is a semi-glib, semi-profound kind of Victorian commonplace. He was also interested in the romance of science, and this is another Victorian commonplace, the idea that science isn't pedantic kind of pencil pushing, it's something that opens up new scope for mystery and imagination. Conan Doyle, while he was interested in kind of mainstream science, famously he found iguanodon footprints near his garden in 1909, which is one of the kind of drivers of the Lost World. He was mostly interested later in life, although starting in the 1880s in supernatural research, spiritualism, most famously the fairies, and if anyone's familiar with the Cottingley fairy photographs taken in 1917, 1920, Conan Doyle was a big defender of these photographs. He wrote in great detail about kind of the realism of them. And also it's worth saying Conan Doyle converted to spiritualism, kind of belief, semi-religious belief in the afterlife, but he converted in 1916. It's often assumed it was because his son died in the First World War, but he was really into it decades before, and he converted before his son died by 2 years. So Conan Doyle, this was kind of a long-standing part of his life. He also famously attacked materialism. He wasn't a Christian by any means, but he really hated any kind of super atheistical beliefs. And he also loved popular science writing, which where he felt like romance and science was most popular, was most convincingly allied. He called it the enchanted garden of science writing. And he really hated scientific jargon and things like that. So I think for Conan Doyle, science is most interesting when it combines the pedantry of his kind of fairy research, which is really quite technical, with vistas of potential, which is really beyond most research. I think he got a little bit bored when you got to be a little bit too kind of proven. Which brings us to, I think, why this is the most suggestive image in The Lost World. So Conan Doyle, before The Lost World had taken place, had supposedly spotted a plesiosaur or an ichthyosaur in the Aegean Sea in 1907. Seems to be 1907, because that's the only time I can find that he was really there. That's what most sources say. But there's no time of him saying that I can find before 1922 in Leicester Natural History Museum, although he refers back to a previous time. And he says in 1925, I didn't tell anyone when it happened because no one would believe me. Of course, this is after he's confessed his belief in fairies by 1925, so actually he doesn't think he has to hold anything back by then. So in 1924, that's the first time he calls it an Ichthyosaurus, but he describes it as a plesiosaurus, which is clearly what he meant. And in 1925, again, he supports the belief it's a plesiosaurus. By 1928, just a few years before he dies, he says it was definitely a plesiosaurus. He also claims his wife Jean saw it as well, though I've never seen, I've not heard her talking about it. Which makes it interesting to look back at images in The Lost World, which supposedly, whatever Conan Doyle thought he saw, are suggestive. This kind of glimpse of the plesiosaurs he drew onto this template here for Forbes to use kind of glimmered just about half seen, which Forbes actually kind of doesn't quite do as well as Conan Doyle does, just by sketching plesiosaurs onto this picture of the Arctic Circle. The Central Lake is a really important location in the novel. It's kind of almost the centre of the romance. At the end of the novel, when they've come back to London and Professor Summerlee is reporting on the expedition, the Central Lake is what the audience in the novel find the most exciting. One reporter says, quote, "It was not, however, until he sketched the mysteries of the Central Lake that the full interest and enthusiasm of the audience were aroused. One had to pinch oneself to be sure that one was awake, as one heard this sane and practical professor in cold, measured tones describing the monstrous three-eyed fish lizards, which are ichthyosaurs, and the huge water snakes which inhabit this enchanted sheet of water." He also describes it as rose-tinted waters. And interestingly, there's a scene where the characters capture what's called a young ichthyosaur. And in 1924, he describes what he saw as a young ichthyosaur. And why does it have to be a young one? Why isn't it just a small species? So I'm not really sure what's going on here. There's two interpretations, aren't there, really? There is Conan Doyle saw something and his memories kind of gradually changed until we find a source earlier. He may have not even decided he saw an ichthyosaur until the 1920s. But there is also the idea that Conan Doyle really did think he'd seen, I'm not going to say whether he actually saw a plesiosaur or an ichthyosaur, but whether he actually thought he had seen one. And this is part of the kind of mock realistic apparatus of a novel. I mean, Conan Doyle would frequently use fiction to make truth claims. His historical novels, he claimed, were more accurate than a lot of the writing on kind of the age of Henry V because of the research he'd poured into them. Most interestingly, in 1925, he brought back Professor Challenger for The Land of Mist, which is a novel about spiritualism, which has an appendices explaining how most of it is true. And interestingly, it also has in the Strand serialization, there's a scene where there is a spiritual seance, and an eagle materializes, and there's an illustration. At the end of that chapter, Conan Doyle reproduces the image from a spiritualist specialist journal of that eagle materializing in real life. And for readers of the Strand who'd read The Lost World 13 years earlier, where there are obvious hoax images, are now being expected that the same character is experiencing something which has basis in fact, and they're supposed to see this image, if they're at all familiar with Conan Doyle, and believe that that image is not a hoax. So the kind of dynamic there is very complicated and weird. So, effectively, I think The Lost World and Forbes' image was as pompous as Forbes' kind of quotes sound about poetry and beauty in this novel that's really quite silly and it's in many ways quite jokey. It do show how seriously they were taken by Conan Doyle and Forbes, and also show how he thought he could bring something to paleontology and the popularization of paleontology by kind of mystifying it, pushing it back. But of course not without compromising the science. You notice they always say for dinosaurs, Forbes and Conan Doyle dinosaurs have to be accurate. And he considered Roundtree's ones to be monsters, basically, monsterization, whereas Forbes saw the ones he used as the truth. And I'll end on one fun fact about The Lost World. Well, it's not very fun for Forbes. There's only one marriage that I'm aware of that's been broken up by The Lost World, and it's the marriage of Forbes and his wife, Millie. There seems to have been, I don't know when it started, but there seems to have been an affair between Ransford, the photographer from The Lost World, and Forbes' wife, Sarah Mildred Forbes, known as Millie. And sometime around 1920, she ran off and lived with Ransford. And as far as I can see, and this is all kind of speculation based on dates, Forbes didn't want to grant a divorce because as soon as he dies in 1939, Ransford and Millie Forbes marry. She becomes Millie Ransford. And so that's the story of the Lost World. Thank you.